Good morning, and welcome to Redeemer Lutheran Church. I'm Pastor Gary Lodeholt. I haven't seen them in a while, but I remember when tangrams were all the rage. If you don't remember what tangrams were, you were given 8 or 9 differently shaped pieces, and then there was the outline of a shape, and the challenge was to fit the pieces you had together in such a way to make that shape. You had to use all the pieces, and you couldn't have any pieces left over. You had to match the shape exactly. Frankly, I didn't do these puzzles very often, mostly because I wasn't very good at them. We are finishing up our second week of focusing on the story of the Bible, and by that I mean things like the kinds of literature that make up the Bible, what makes it Scripture and other things not Scripture, and how it all got put together. Last week we focused on the Old Testament, and this week we have been looking at the New Testament. We've talked about the Gospels and what makes each distinctive or alike with the others, some other texts that are suspect as Gospels, and then about Paul's letters. Believe it or not, after all that, there is still more to consider. You see, Paul wasn't the only writer who has letters or essays in the New Testament. We talked about how Paul's letters began to circulate and how they had a clear viewpoint expressing the grace and love of God and the role of faith in life. But there were other letters that circulated with different viewpoints. Books like James, Hebrews, 1st and 2nd Peter, and more that were important too. The early church saw these letters not in conflict, but rather complementary. Like gems have different facets, they saw Paul presenting one or more facets, and these other works presenting other facets, and together they make up the beautiful gem of our faith. Most everything that we now have in our New Testament had been written by about the year 100. That's about when the early church fathers began putting out lists of what letters their community followed and found authoritative. The content of the letter was important, to be sure, but the letter's connection to one or another of the apostles was also significant. So, sometimes, some of the letters in the New Testament might say they were written by Paul or John or Peter that were really written by someone else, but they were ascribed the letter to those apostles to give the letter more authority. If people thought it came from one of the apostles, they were more likely to read it and pay attention. One of the first people to start circulating a list of books that he thought were authoritative for guiding faith was a man named Marcion. Marcion ruled out everything except the letters of Paul and the Gospel of Luke, which he purged of any reference to Jews. Marcion got a following, but later became a heretic when he said that Jesus was only a spirit and had no physical body. That meant, in Marcion's view, Jesus only appeared to die. Since the resurrection of a physical body was important to faith, Marcion got all this wrong. However, Marcion's list of scriptures led to other lists being put out. Actually, these different lists of preferred scriptures went on for several hundred years. Interestingly, Revelation was accepted generally pretty early on. Then it was rejected, and then accepted again. Finally, in the year 367, the bishop in Alexandria in Egypt put out a list of books he found authoritative as part of his annual Easter letter, and his list had 27 books, and those became established as the New Testament as we have it today. He also listed several other books that were useful for faith, but not scriptural. With today's books, we can look at the spine of the book to see the title or the author. However, in the early church, things were written on scrolls which didn't have that. That's no problem if all you have is one gospel like Mark, But suppose you have a Gospel of Matthew too. How do you tell the difference? Eventually, they had the idea to add a leather hanging to the end cap that said something like, according to Matthew. And that was how they told the difference. Now, believe it or not, after 2 weeks, there is still more to say about the story of the Bible. Join us next week as we talk about things like how translation happens, some history of the English Bible, and finally, which Bible you should use. Thanks for watching, and remember to let this day belong to God.